The forest was alive with the whispers of the night, a symphony of rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. A thick mist clung to the ground, swirling around the boots of Officer Elena Vasquez as she crouched behind a moss-covered log, her breath steady but shallow. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear that lingered at the back of her throat. Elena adjusted the strap of her tactical vest, her fingers brushing against the cold polymer of her sidearm. She was no stranger to danger. Her 5 years in the narcotics division had hardened her, but tonight felt different. The intel had been too perfect, too convenient. A tip from a low-level cartel informant had led them here, to this remote stretch of woodland just outside the city, where the Rivera cartel was supposedly unloading a shipment of high-powered weapons. "We move in fast and quiet," her captain had said during the briefing. No mistakes. Yet as she scanned the clearing ahead, where a lone black SUV sat idling under the pale glow of the moon, something gnawed at her instincts. The vehicle was unmarked, its windows tinted to obscurity. No guards. No movement. Just silence. Beside her, Sergeant Jake Carter shifted, his rifle resting against his shoulder. "Too easy," he muttered, echoing her thoughts. Elena nodded. Something's off. Before she could voice her doubts, a crackling voice came through her earpiece. "Team Alpha in position. No visual on targets. Proceeding as planned." Captain Reyes' orders were clear. Move in, secure the weapons, and apprehend anyone on site. But as Elena's team advanced, fanning out in a practiced formation, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos. A single gunshot split the night. Elena barely had time to react before the world erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the trees like strobes, the deafening roar of automatic weapons drowning out shouted commands. Bullets tore through the underbrush, shredding leaves and splintering bark. Ambush! Carter's voice was raw with panic as he yanked Elena behind a tree. She spun, pressing her back against the rough bark, her heart hammering against her ribs. The clearing had transformed into a kill zone. Shadows moved between the trees, figures in black, their faces obscured by balaclavas. They fired with chilling precision. To her left, Officer Ramirez went down with a choked gasp, blood blooming across his chest. "Ramirez!" Elena lunged, but Carter grabbed her arm. "We're sitting ducks. Fall back." The team scrambled for cover, returning fire, but the cartel had them surrounded. Elena's ears rang from the gunfire, her vision tunneling as she fired at a masked figure charging toward her. The man dropped, but another took his place. Then pain. A searing heat tore through her side as a bullet grazed her ribs. She stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood soaked through her white shirt, the fabric clinging to her skin. "Elena!" Carter's voice was distant. She turned just in time to see him take a bullet to the throat. His body crumpled. "No! No!" A shadow loomed over her. Before she could raise her weapon, a rifle but slammed into her temple. White-hot agony exploded behind her eyes. The forest spun, blurred, then faded to black as strong hands dragged her into the abyss. The last thing she heard was a voice, cold and mocking. "The boss is gonna love you." That was the first thing Elena Vasquez became aware of, a suffocating, impenetrable blackness that pressed against her eyelids like a physical weight. Her skull throbbed in time with her heartbeat, each pulse sending jagged needles of pain radiating from her temple down to her jaw. A metallic taste filled her mouth, blood, she realized, and she swallowed hard, her throat raw as if she'd been screaming. "Where am I?" The question slithered through the fog of her mind, but before she could grasp it, a jolt of movement sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. She was moving, not on her own. Her body swayed limply, her shoulder jammed against something hard and unyielding. The rumble of an engine vibrated through her bones. A vehicle. She was in a vehicle. Memory crashed over her like ice water. The ambush, the gunfire, Carter falling, the rifle but slamming into her skull. Oh God, the cartel has me. Her breath hitched, but she forced herself to stay still, to keep her limbs slack. If her captors thought she was unconscious, she might have seconds to assess her situation. The air inside the car was thick with the stench of sweat, gun oil, and cheap cigarette smoke. The seat beneath her was cracked leather, the edges digging into her bare arms. Her hands were bound behind her back, zip ties, from the bite of plastic against her wrists. Her duty belt was gone. No gun, no radio, no backup. A voice cut through the darkness, rough and amused. She's twitching. I think Sleeping Beauty's waking up. A calloused hand gripped her chin, yanking her head upright. Elena let her eyelids flutter weakly, feigning disorientation as light, harsh and artificial, seared her vision. The interior of the SUV came into focus. 2 men in the front seats, a third beside her in the back, his fingers still digging into her face. He was massive, his shoulders straining against his black tactical vest, a jagged scar running from his eyebrow down to his cheek. His breath smelled of stale tobacco as he leaned closer, grinning. "Welcome back, Policia." Elena's pulse spiked, but she kept her voice steady. "Where are you taking me?" The man, Scarface, she mentally labeled him, chuckled. "Somewhere you'll wish you died in that forest." The driver, a wiry man with a shaved head, snorted. "Mateo's gonna have fun with you." Mateo Rivera. The name sent a cold ripple down her spine. The cartel's leader wasn't just ruthless. He was creative with his enemies. Elena tested her bond subtly, but the zip ties only bit deeper. Her side ached where the bullet had grazed her, the wound crusted with dried blood. She needed to think, to survive. The SUV swerved sharply, throwing her against the door. Through the tinted window, the world outside was a blur of dense trees and crumbling asphalt. They were heading deeper into the wilderness, away from the city, away from help. Scarface pulled a knife from his belt, twirling it lazily. "You know how many cops we've buried out here?" He dragged the blade along her arm, not deep enough to cut, but enough to make her muscles tense. None of them screamed as pretty as you will. Elena clenched her jaw. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She focused on details instead. The SUV's make, a Toyota 4Runner, older model. The weapons, AKs, Glocks. The lack of seatbelts, careless. Then a break in the trees. The vehicle slowed, tires crunching over gravel as they turned onto a narrow dirt road. Ahead, a derelict hunting cabin loomed, its wooden walls sagging, the porch littered with empty liquor bottles. 2 armed men stood guard outside, their postures relaxed. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a hub. The SUV stopped. Scarface wrenched open the door, hauling Elena out by her arm. Her legs buckled, but he held her upright, shoving her forward. "Move." The guards leered as she passed. One reached out, trailing a finger down her cheek. "Nice catch." Elena recoiled, but Scarface just laughed, steering her toward the cabin. The door creaked open, revealing a dim interior lit by a single kerosene lamp. The air reeked of mildew and something fouler, blood maybe. A metal chair sat in the center of the room, its legs bolted to the floor. Her stomach dropped. "Sit," Scarface ordered, kicking the chair. Elena hesitated, just for a second, but a sharp blow to her kidneys sent her crashing into the seat. Hands forced her down, tightening new restraints around her ankles and wrists. The cold metal bit into her skin. Across the room, a shadow detached itself from the wall. A woman tall, with a sleek ponytail and a pistol holstered at her hip, stepped into the light. Her smile was all teeth. "Officer Vasquez," she purred. "We've been waiting for you." Elena's mouth went dry. This wasn't just interrogation. This was a game, and she was the prey. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting jagged shadows across the woman's face as she circled Elena like a vulture eyeing carrion. Up close, her features were sharp, high cheekbones, a thin scar tracing her jawline, eyes so dark they swallowed the lamplight whole. She stopped just inches from the chair, the toe of her boot nudging Elena's shin. "You're quieter than I expected," she mused. "Most cops beg by now." Elena lifted her chin, ignoring the tremor in her bound hands. "What do you want?" The woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and turned toward a rickety table littered with tools, pliers, a blowtorch, a stained bone saw. She trailed her fingers over them before picking up a syringe, filled with amber liquid. You know what we want, Garita. Names. Locations. Every dirty secret your unit's been hiding. She tapped the needle, watching a bead of liquid form at the tip. You'll talk. The only question is how much you'll scream first. Elena's mouth went dry. Drugs. Truth serum. Or worse. She'd seen what cartels did to traders, peeling skin with acid, drowning lungs in gasoline. But this woman wasn't just a torturer. She was a strategist. The tools weren't just for pain. They were for theater. A door banged open behind them. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and gunpowder. The guard snapped to attention as boots thudded across the floorboards. Him, Mateo Rivera, didn't need an introduction. He moved like a man who owned the earth beneath his feet. 6'3", shoulders broad beneath a tailored suit jacket, his beard threaded with silver. A gold crucifix glinted at his throat, absurd against the cruelty in his eyes. He didn't look at Elena at first, just nodded at the woman. Valentina. Any progress? Valentina smirked. She's stubborn. Mateo finally turned, his gaze scraping over Elena's battered form. Ah, the famous officer Vasquez. His voice was velvet-wrapped steel. You killed 4 of my men tonight. Elena spat blood at his shoes. Should have been more. The cabin went dead silent. Then Mateo chuckled, crouching until they were eye level. I like you, he murmured, as if sharing a secret. So I'll offer a bargain. He snapped his fingers. 2 cartel thugs dragged in a hooded figure, shoving them to their knees. Elena's breath caught as they yanked off the hood, Daniel. Her baby brother's face was a mess of bruises, his lips split, but his eyes flared with recognition. Elena. A guard pistol whipped him across the temple. Daniel crumpled with a groan. Elena lunged against her restraints, the chair screeching against the floor. Stop! Mateo grabbed her hair, wrenching her head back. Your brother lives if you cooperate. Refuse. He nodded to Valentina, who pressed her pistol to Daniel's knee. Pain is a language even heroes understand. Elena's mind raced. Daniel was a civilian, a kid who'd been at the wrong dorm party when the cartel grabbed him. This wasn't just interrogation, it was a message. The Rivera cartel didn't just break bones. They broke loyalty. Valentina cocked a hammer. Habla ahora, policía. Elena's voice cracked. Wait. The gun's muzzle pressed into Daniel's knee like a promise of shattered bone, and time seemed to fracture around Elena. Her little brother's face, pale beneath the blood and dirt, his dark eyes wide with a fear he was trying so hard to hide, flashed her back to 1,000 moments, teaching him to ride a bike, patching up his scraped knees, swearing to their mother before she died that she'd always protect him. That vow roared in her ears now, louder than Valentina's taunts or Mateo's calm, monstrous patience. Think. Move. Now. Elena forced a shuddering breath, letting her shoulders slump in feigned defeat. All right, she whispered, voice cracking. I'll talk. Mateo's grip on her hair loosened slightly. Smart girl. Valentina didn't lower the gun. Elena licked her split lip, buying seconds. The safe house codes, their 2-part authentication. I need my badge. She jerked her chin toward the table where Scarface had dumped her gear, the chips embedded in it. A lie, but a believable one. Mateo studied her, then nodded to a guard. Get it. The moment the man turned, Elena's muscles coiled. Her fingers, still bound behind her, had been working subtly against the zip tie's edge. Not enough to break free, but enough to slide her wristwatch's jagged clasp against the plastic. A few more seconds. The guard tossed her badge onto her lap. Elena bent forward as if to examine it, masking the way her wrists twisted. The tie snapped. Chaos erupted. She lunged sideways, driving her elbow into Valentina's ribs. The woman gasped, the gun discharging into the floorboards as Elena snatched the syringe from the table and jammed it into Scarface's thigh. He bellowed, swiping at her, but the drugs hit fast. His knees buckled. Daniel, run. Her brother didn't hesitate. He tackled the nearest guard, buying Elena a heartbeat to grab the fallen pistol. Shots rang out. A bullet grazed her shoulder, but she returned fire, dropping the lamp. Kerosene exploded across the floor, flames licking up the walls in a sudden, roaring curtain. Mateo roared orders, but the smoke was thick, the cartel scrambling. Elena seized Daniel's arm, dragging him toward a back window. Glass shattered under her boot as they tumbled into the night. The forest swallowed them, branches whipping at their faces as they sprinted blind. Behind them, shouts and the pop of gunfire faded, but Elena knew better than to slow down. The cartel had vehicles, dogs, resources. Daniel stumbled. "Elena, I can't." She hauled him up. "Yes, you can." The old ranger station was a mile northeast. If they could reach it, if the radio still worked. A howl cut through the trees. Not an animal. A hound. They were being hunted. The howl of the bloodhounds cut through the night like a siren, their guttural barks growing louder with every ragged breath Elena and Daniel took as they crashed through the undergrowth. Branches lashed at their arms and faces, leaving thin red welts in their wake, but neither dared to slow. Not when the snapping jaws and the shouts of cartel men echoed just a few hundred yards behind them. The moon, half hidden behind scudding clouds, offered only slivers of light, turning the forest into a labyrinth of shadows and pitfalls. Daniel's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, his injured leg dragging, but Elena refused to let him fall. She gripped his wrist tighter, her fingers slick with sweat and blood, and yanked him forward. "Almost there," she hissed, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. The ranger station was supposed to be their salvation, a crumbling outpost with an old radio, the one hope of calling for backup. But as they burst into a small clearing, Elena's heart plummeted. The building was a skeleton of its former self, its roof caved in, the door hanging off rusted hinges. The radio mast was bent at a drunken angle, wires dangling like severed veins. "No, no, no, no." Daniel sagged against her. "We're dead." Elena shook him hard. "No, we're not." She dragged him inside, kicking aside debris, searching for anything, a weapon, a phone, a miracle. The radio console was smashed, but the power light flickered weakly. A spark of hope. She wrenched open the maintenance panel, fingers flying over frayed circuits. If she could just hotwire it. A gunshot splintered the doorframe. Mateo Rivera stepped into the doorway, silhouetted by the firelight still glowing from the distant cabin. His suit was torn, his knuckles bloody, but his smile was calm, inevitable. "You're out of road, officer." Behind him, Valentina emerged, her face a mask of fury, a hunting rifle leveled at Daniel's chest. Elena's hand closed around a rusted screwdriver. Mateo sighed. "You're going to watch your brother die. Then you'll give me what I want. And then," he cocked his pistol, "you'll beg me to pull this trigger." Elena's pulse roared in her ears. No more running. No more bargains. She lunged. The world narrowed to chaos. Valentina's rifle barked, was splintering near Daniel's head as he dove behind a desk. Elena drove the screwdriver into Mateo's thigh. He bellowed, backhanding her hard enough to send her crashing into the radio console. Sparks rained down as she scrambled up, grabbing a shard of broken glass. Across the room, Daniel hurled a chair at Valentina. The woman staggered, and Elena moved, slamming the glass into her gun arm. Valentina screamed, the rifle clattering to the floor. Mateo fired. The bullet tore through Elena's side, white-hot agony searing her vision. She fell to her knees, blood soaking her shirt. Daniel shouted her name, but the sound was distant, drowned by the sudden whump of helicopter blades. "What?" Blue and red lights strobed through the trees. Shouts, "Police! Hands where we can see them!" "SWAT! Back up!" Mateo's face twisted with rage. He raised his gun. A sniper shot took him in the shoulder. He dropped like a stone. Valentina fled into the trees, but the hounds of justice were here now, and they didn't lose prey. As blackness crept into the edges of her vision, Elena felt Daniel's arms around her, his tears hot on her neck. "You did it," he choked out. Elena smiled, tasting blood. Not yet. The gunshot wound in Elena's side burned like a brand as she was loaded into the ambulance, the sterile white interior too bright, too clean compared to the blood and sweat and dirt that caked her skin. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away her ruined shirt to expose the ragged hole where Mateo's bullet had torn through muscle. Daniel hovered nearby, his face pale beneath the grime, his hands shaking as he clutched the foil blanket someone had draped over his shoulders. "Elena!" His voice cracked. She forced a smile, even as the paramedic pressed a wad of gauze to her wound and pain lanced through her. "I've had worse," she lied. Outside, the forest was alive with flashing lights and shouted orders. SWAT teams swept the trees, their rifles raised, hunting for Valentina. The Rivera cartel's men were being rounded up, some in cuffs, some in body bags. But Mateo himself was already gone, whisked away in a separate ambulance under heavy guard. The sniper's bullet had only grazed his shoulder. He'd live, and that meant this wasn't over. The ambulance door slammed shut, cutting off the chaos. As the vehicle lurched forward, Elena closed her eyes. But the images came anyway. Valentina's snarling face, the glint of the screwdriver in Mateo's thigh, the way Daniel had looked at her when he thought she might die. A hand squeezed hers. She opened her eyes to see Daniel staring at her, his jaw set. "They're going to pay for this," he said, low and fierce. Elena tightened her grip on his fingers. She wanted to promise him justice. She wanted to swear that Mateo would rot in a cell, that Valentina would never hurt anyone again. But the truth was darker. The Rivera cartel wasn't just one man. It was a hydra, cut off one head, and two more grew in its place. Mateo might be in custody, but his network was vast, his allies ruthless, and Valentina was still out there. Somewhere in the night, a woman with a scarred jaw and a pistol was running, and she was pissed. The safe house reeked of cigarette smoke and stale sweat, the boarded-up windows blocking out all but thin slivers of moonlight. Valentina Rivera pressed a blood-soaked rag to her wounded arm, her teeth gritted against the pain. The glass shard Elena had buried in her flesh still burned, a reminder of her failure and her humiliation. Around her, the remnants of the Rivera cartel's inner circle sat in tense silence, their faces grim. The news had spread fast. Mateo was in custody. The police had raided 3 warehouses. Their empire was crumbling, and it was all Elena Vasquez's fault. Valentina slammed her fist onto the rickety table, making the men flinch. "Enough sitting," she snarled. "We're not hiding like rats." A scarred enforcer named Rico leaned forward. "Without Mateo got sloppy," she snapped. "He underestimated her. I won't." She stood, ignoring the throbbing in her arm, and yanked a map from the wall. The city sprawled across it, marked with red X's, police stations, patrol routes, the hospital where Elena was recovering. Valentina traced a finger over the ladder, her lips curling. She thinks she's won, that she's safe. A phone buzzed. Rico answered, his expression darkening. "They're transferring Mateo to maximum security at dawn." Valentina's smile turned razor-sharp. "Then we hit the convoy." The men stirred, uneasy. "That's suicide," someone muttered. She turned, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You'd rather rot in hiding? Let Mateo die in a cage." She pulled a pistol from her waistband, sliding it across the table. "We take back what's ours. And Vasquez." Her thumb brushed the trigger. "I kill her slow." The hospital room froze in a single, breathless instant. The gun's barrel a black void leveled at Daniel's temple. Valentina's finger taut on the trigger, her dark eyes alight with something far worse than rage. Anticipation. She wanted Elena to move, to scream, to plead. The heart monitor's steady beat became a shrill whine as Elena's pulse spiked. Her muscles coiled despite the agony in her side. Daniel's eyes locked onto hers. "Don't," his gaze screamed. Valentina smirked. "No speeches." She cocked a hammer. Just a quick click then. Elena moved. She hurled the stand like a javelin. The metal pole struck Valentina's wrist with a crack, the gun clattering to the floor. Daniel lunged, tackling the cartel lieutenant into the hallway as Elena ripped the needle from her arm and rolled off the bed. Pain exploded through her stitches, but she gritted her teeth and staggered upright, snatching the fallen pistol. The hallway was a war zone. Daniel grappled with Valentina near the nurse's station, his injured leg buckling as she drove a knee into his ribs. 2 cartel thugs sprinted toward them from the stairwell, rifles raised. Elena fired, once, twice, dropping one man mid-stride. The other ducked behind a supply cart, overturning it with a crash of glass and metal. Daniel down. He barely dodged as Valentina's knife slashed where his throat had been. Elena squeezed the trigger again. Click. Empty. Valentina laughed, wiping blood from her split lip. Dios, you're fun. She flicked the knife toward Elena, but Mateo's waiting. A distant boom shook the building. The convoy. They were hitting it now. Elena's mind raced. Even if she could stop Valentina, Mateo would be free within the hour. The city would burn. Unless she feinted left, then dove right, snatching a scalpel from a fallen med cart. Valentina lunged, but Elena twisted, driving the blade into her thigh. The woman howled, recoiling long enough for Daniel to land a punch that sent her sprawling into the wall. Go! Daniel gasped, yanking open the stairwell door. Stop the convoy. Elena hesitated. Leaving him here, Elena. His voice was raw. End this. Another explosion rattled the windows. She ran. The convoy 3 armored trucks sped down the freeway. SWAT teams braced for impact. They never saw the dump truck plow through the guardrail. Metal screamed as the vehicles collided, the lead truck flipping end over end. Gunmen swarmed the wreckage, their faces masked, their rifles spitting fire. In the chaos, no one noticed the figure slipping into the overturned transport vehicle, until Mateo Rivera emerged, his cuffs gone, a dead guard's pistol in his hand. His smile vanished when he saw her. Elena stood 20 yards away, blood soaking through her hospital gown, a shotgun leveled at his chest. Last chance, she panted. Kneel. Mateo raised his weapon. The blast echoed for miles. The gunshot's echo faded into the ringing silence of the freeway, the acrid stench of burning rubber and spilled gasoline clinging to the air. Mateo Rivera lay motionless in a spreading pool of crimson, his unseeing eyes still locked onto Elena's face, as if even in death, he refused to look away. The shotgun trembled in her hands, its barrel smoking. Around her, the ambush site was a tableau of chaos. Overturned vehicles, groaning wounded, the distant wail of sirens growing louder. Someone shouted her name, but the sound was muffled, distant, as if she were underwater. She had just killed a man in cold blood, and she didn't regret it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't the clean justice of an arrest, of a trial, of due process. This was vengeance, raw and unfiltered. The weight of it settled into her bones, a burden she would carry forever. A hand grabbed her shoulder. Lieutenant Hayes, his face streaked with soot, his voice urgent. Vasquez, we need to move. Reinforcements are inbound, but Valentina's still out there. Valentina. The name snapped her back to the present. Daniel was still at the hospital. If Valentina had escaped, Elena turned, her movements mechanical, her mind already shifting to the next threat. Get me a car. Now. St. Mary's Hospital. 14 minutes earlier, Daniel Vasquez pressed his back against the shattered nurse's station, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, blurring his vision. Across the hallway, Valentina rose slowly from where his punch had sent her sprawling. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You fight better than your sister, she taunted, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. But you still lose. The knife in her grip glinted under the flickering fluorescence. Daniel's legs screamed in protest as he pushed himself upright. He had no weapons, no backup, just his fists and the desperate hope that Elena would make it in time. Then gunfire erupted outside. Valentina's head snapped toward the sound, her smirk fading. That was all the opening Daniel needed. He lunged, driving his shoulder into her ribs. They crashed through a supply closet door, shelves collapsing around them in a rain of bandages and glass bottles. Valentina snarled, slashing wildly with the knife. Daniel barely dodged, feeling the blade graze his side. He grabbed the first thing his fingers closed around, a metal pole, and swung. The impact sent Valentina reeling, her knife skittering across the floor. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Then she laughed. You think this is over? She spat, backing toward the emergency exit. The cartel doesn't die with Mateo, and neither do I. With that, she vanished into the stairwell, leaving Daniel slumped against the wall, his body aching, his mind racing. She was right. This wasn't over. The aftermath by dawn, the headlines were already screaming. Cartel kingpin dead in daring prison ambush. Officer involved shooting under investigation. Elena sat in the precinct's interrogation room, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched. Internal affairs had been grilling her for hours, their questions sharp, their eyes suspicious. Did you have to kill him? Why were you at the convoy site alone? What are you telling us? She gave them nothing. The door creaked open, and Captain Reyes stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He dropped a file onto the table. Crime scene photos from the hospital. The convoy, Mateo's body. You're suspended, he said flatly. Pending review. Elena didn't flinch. And Valentina? Reyes sighed. Gone. But she'll surface. They always do. He slid a badge across the table, her badge. Then quieter. When she does, you didn't hear this from me. Elena pocketed the badge, her fingers brushing the cool metal. She knew what came next. Rain sheeted down in icy curtains, turning the abandoned meatpacking district into a labyrinth of slick asphalt and shifting shadows. Elena Vasquez moved through the storm like a ghost, her boots silent against the wet concrete, her Glock a familiar weight in her hands. The tip had come in an hour ago, unsigned, untraceable, but she knew. Valentina was here. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted gates hanging open like a challenge. Inside, the air reeked of blood and ammonia, the cavernous space lit only by flickering emergency lights. Crates were stacked haphazardly, perfect for ambushes. Elena's finger rested against the trigger guard. She didn't call out. There were past words now. A scrape of metal to her left. She spun, firing twice. A cartel thug crumpled behind a pallet, his rifle clattering to the ground. Hija de puta. Valentina's voice echoed from the catwalk above. A muzzle flashed. Elena dove behind a forklift as bullets punched through the air where she'd stood. You're slow tonight, Policia, Valentina taunted, her footsteps ringing on the metal grating. Guilt keeping you up? Elena ejected her spent magazine, slamming in a fresh one. Just saving my last bullet for you. A pause. Then laughter, low and vicious. Come take it then. Elena moved. The final battle was a dance of gunfire and blades, Valentina leaping down to meet her, a machete glinting in her grip. Steel kissed Elena's forearm as she barely parried, countering with a knee to Valentina's ribs. They crashed into a conveyor belt, rolling, snarling, each fighting for the killing strike. Then, the click of an empty chamber. Valentina grinned, raising her machete. Told you you'd beg. Elena's hand closed around a meat hook. The scream was almost musical. Epilogue. 1 month later, the headlines called it a victory. The brass called it closure. Elena stood at Daniel's graduation, his police academy badge shining under the sun, and said nothing about the scars beneath her sleeves, or the nightmares that still woke her, gasping, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Across the crowd, a reporter snapped photos of the hero cop. Elena turned away. Some wars didn't end. They just waited.